Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're joined by Meric Craig Bloch, a widely respected voice in workplace and corporate investigations. He has more than 25 years of experience as an attorney, compliance officer, and global head of investigations. He has also led over 800 investigations worldwide, trained thousands of professionals, and written several well-known books for investigations and compliance practitioners. He is also the founder of Winter Investigations and the creator of the Winter Method. It is a practical approach that helps organizations use investigations not only to resolve issues, but also to improve operations, uncover insights, and support business goals. We're looking forward to hearing from him today about his career journey, the lessons he's learned along the way, and his thoughts on the future of investigations. Before we begin, a quick word about FaceUp. In many workplaces, concerns or sensitive issues never get reported, whether out of fear, uncertainty, or simply not knowing how. That silence can allow for misconduct, safety risks, or ethical problems to grow unchecked. FaceUp is an anonymous reporting and engagement platform used today in more than 70 countries and by over 3,500 organizations. It gives employees a safe way to raise their voices so that leaders can act early. I'm Daniëlla from FaceUp, and I'll be guiding today's conversation with Meric. Hi, Meric, and welcome. That was a long-winded intro, but very nice to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to talk about one of my favorite topics, workplace investigations.
Well, let's start at the beginning. You have a very impressive career, but what first sparked your interest in compliance and investigations?
What first sparked it for me was I come from a law enforcement family. My grandfather was in the New York Police Department, my personal hero, my role model. And I guess I always wanted to be a policeman. I wound up going to law school. I became a lawyer. Being a lawyer was something I did, but it never really spoke to me. And then I had the opportunity to kind of merge the two, and then become a corporate investigator. And I kind of was able to merge my profession with my calling. And 25 years later, here I am.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, the pivoting that you've had from police in your family to becoming a lawyer to then going into corporate investigations.
Yeah, I have a very interesting LinkedIn profile. If you were to look at my LinkedIn profile, it's amazing because at this point in my career, it actually looks like a tapestry where you have all of these threads that by this point have all seemed to have wound together. I guess, what we realize is our careers are not linear. And at the time they can seem kind of chaotic, but at some point they all weave together.
I completely agree with that. And it's also about taking opportunities and going a little bit out of your comfort zone sometimes. If you are to look back, is there a moment that you say, okay, this defined my career path?
Yes, there is one case. So, after I left law firm life, I did what many lawyers do. You start off in a law firm, and then for many of us, you say, look, the law firm life is not really for me. And you go into a corporation and you become what's called an in-house counsel, an in-house lawyer. And as luck would have it, the case that I worked on was a $1.5 million fraud case, and it was an internal fraud scheme. And I actually was the sole investigator. I had started doing internal investigations in the company, but as you would imagine, they were kind of small-time cases, misconduct cases, not big deal. And here was the scheme. It was a vendor fraud scheme, and it involved the vice president of our IT department. And the VP was leading a large data migration project. And this is where the company had all these different data centers, and they were trying to merge them all into one gigantic location for efficiency's sake and things like that. And The vice president colluded with an outside vendor, and the outside vendor would submit these completely fabricated invoices for work that was never done. The VP would approve them, company would pay them, and they'd split the money. And by the time this scheme was detected, the company had paid out $1.5 million. Now, the thing that was intriguing about it was I knew this vice president. This person was no different than you, me, or anyone else who's watching our webinar. We were at the same management level. We traveled in the same circles. So I caught the investigation. I worked on this case exclusively for 6 weeks. It caught the attention of the board of directors in Switzerland. It was that brief shining moment where the CEO takes my calls. I call his office, and his EA would say, "Hold on, he'll be right with you." That's that brief moment of glory. It even caught the attention of the media. My investigation report was 30 pages long. It was a roadmap with the evidence. It went to the FBI. It went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I did one of the things your investigations have to do, I know you're not going to talk about this, investigations, have to be focused on the business, what went wrong in the business and business improvement. My root cause analysis, I did a separate memo on root cause analysis that showed a ton of missed flags. Because think about it, you don't lose $1.5 million unless a lot of things go wrong. Unacceptable business risks. Well, anyway, the two of them get indicted, and they plead guilty, and they both go to federal prison. But here's another thing that I learned. It is that I did an excellent job, right? I think if you could pan larger on the wall, there's a commendation letter I got from the U.S. Attorney's Office. But my work destroyed the lives of these two people. I absolutely did my job. I was there to collect the bill. And what did I learn, though? It made me respect the power that an investigator has, that you can change the life of other people. But it also showed me the need for an investigator to fix the business. So even though it wasn't my first case, I think that was the pivotal one that kind of, was the one that was the game changer in my career.
Well, I can understand that because $1.5 million, and as you said, two people ended up in prison. It's quite an impact both on the business side and then on people's personal lives. So.
But it also showed me what an investigator can do. It showed me the impact I could have professionally. It showed me the impact of showcasing my value, my talents. So in other words, it really was a case where you really could see all that you were capable of doing in every sense of that word. So that's why, when I look back on that case, it was, that impactful in so many different ways and transformative in my career.
I completely understand that because you end up seeing how you can bring value to the businesses and organizations that you're working with. So, yes, completely understand that. And as you mentioned earlier, you have a very interesting LinkedIn profile. So your career has been very colorful, let's say, so far. And you have worked across different industries, let's say healthcare and tech. And these are different beasts or environments, let's say. Have these different industries shaped how you approach investigations or how you navigate them? Certainly.
So I've been an investigator and a consultant for healthcare organizations, healthcare providers. So, what are they thinking when it comes to investigations? Well, in the United States, for example, they bill, because we don't have a nationalized healthcare system, healthcare providers bill the federal government for the services they provide, and they're reimbursed by the federal government for those services. If you don't bill correctly, that can be a federal crime. So when you investigate possible irregularities in billing, You have to get right to the bottom of it, detect why it's happening, root cause analysis, or you risk civil or criminal penalties. You also have to investigate patient safety. So anything that could harm a patient, you've got to look into. Many of them are nonprofits that do fundraising, so you've got to look into it that way. And also, they have cultures that are hierarchical, right? So you're often dealing with doctors with egos and cultures that are like, how dare you ask me to explain myself? So you have to deal with that dimension. I've also worked in tech companies, right? So when they're thinking about, they do everything quick. They're entrepreneurial, right? They have a startup mentality, right? The culture favors action more than it favors reflection, right? But meanwhile, when you do investigations, we favor analysis, right? We favor reflection, and they favor fix it, drive on, right? Off to the next best thing. Now, how do you balance that inherent conflict, right? The other thing in a tech company is the workforce tends to be younger with less professional maturity, right? Workplace standards are more relaxed. HR standards are often less enforced, right? So you tend to, in my experience, right, when you have office parties, you have a lot of office romance, and oh my goodness, it's a full-time job just for that, right? Most of my time was spent in public companies. They have a fix it and drive on mentality, right? They're focused on their quarterly numbers. Very much public companies. Public companies are not run by boards of directors. Public companies are run by external auditors, right? So anything about financial irregularities, anything about fraud, or anything that risks the financial records being bright and tight and beautiful. So investigations relating to that have to be rock solid. Things relating to reputation risk, very, very strong. But on the other hand, with investigations in those contexts, big fear of rocking the boat, right? There's a lot of the opposite of the tech company, which is very, innovative, entrepreneurial, try new things. A lot of these companies, like when I was at AT&T, a lot of these older mainline companies, in every country, you're going to have these companies, real inertia, real, like, let's not make waves. It's the way we've always done it. So if you try to come in and you say, look, I'm a business advisor, I discovered this problem, we should change it, right? It's going to be like, no, it's too much. Change isn't good, right? So this is the counter pressure that you're going to run into when you say, I'm an investigator. I just identified these ways we could make business better. So that's what I've learned.
Well, that was a very complete picture, I would say. And I think I hear this, and my colleagues as well, whenever we're speaking with people from these different industries that you mentioned, some of these concerns. Like, some people want to take action, and it's not about, let's analyze this, let's see how we can do better. Others are very afraid of rocking the boat. So yeah. I think that you painted a very accurate picture of the different industries, which makes me think that, like in all professions, it can be very hard to be a good investigator. In your opinion, what separates a good investigator from a truly great one?
I get this question a lot, because you can be a good investigator, right? Just line up and ask some good questions. I think it comes down to 4 core values. One is you've got to have critical thinking skills, right? Because you can go into interviews and stuff and you can just ask questions off a checklist, right? Critical thinking is important because during an investigation, you have to make strategic decisions and you have to make tactical decisions, right? Strategic decisions is, how am I going to approach this case? Tactical decisions are like when you're in an interview and all of a sudden you find this person doesn't want to communicate with you, or all of a sudden they'd say, I'm not going to answer any more of your questions, or things like that. And right in the middle of the interview, you have to change your approach, right? That's a tactical decision. So critical thinking, right? You have to be able to, and you have to be kind of curious, right? Like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? That's one. The second thing that makes a great investigator is empathy. You have to be able to think like the other person. the person across the table you're interviewing, the subject, the person who's been accused of wrongdoing. And that's the ability, because if you can understand how that other person is thinking, then you can understand why they may have done that. And then you can kind of decode and break the code of why did this happen? And then you can understand. And in other words, because human beings act rationally, right? And so if I can understand why you may have done something, then I can put all the pieces together. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that I agree with you at all, but I have to, as an investigator, I have to explain. The next thing is respect. A good investigator respects the other person. Now, respect doesn't mean that I approve what you did at all. Quite the opposite. But respect, if I treat you with respect, it means I'm a professional, that I'm representing the organization. So it's not my personal respect I'm giving you on behalf of the organization. And if I treat you with respect, that is going to be the best dynamic for me to get information from you. And the last thing that I think makes a good investigator, a great investigator is I'm going to allow you to keep your dignity. There is no reason for me to make you feel ashamed. I just need you to admit what you did. And I don't have to force you to surrender your self-respect. So I think those four values are what separates a good investigator from a great investigator.
This that you just mentioned, and also what you previously said about the different industries and the, let's say, difficulties that some of these industries have in handling investigations, makes me want to ask the question of what are the most common mistakes you have seen throughout your career that organizations make when handling workplace investigations?
First one is the investigator doesn't stay in their role. The investigator's first, what I mean by that is the investigator's not a prosecutor. The investigator is there just to learn the true facts about what happened, so those facts can be compared to paired to a rule. Right? The investigator is not a prosecutor. The investigator is there not to boil the ocean. The investigator is not there to solve every possible issue and every possible problem that grew out of that incident. So stay within your role, focused on that. The next problem is poor handling. If you do get a chance to talk to the person who made the report, not call it the reporter, you may call it the complainant, you may call it the whistleblower, whatever word you choose. But if you do get a chance to talk to that person, investigators can sometimes handle that person poorly. You don't really talk to them. You don't validate their concerns. You don't manage their expectations. You don't really guide them about what happens now. You just kind of take their information and kind of forget about them and leave them hanging. And also, if you care about a speak-up culture, this is a terrible mistake to make, because they walk away feeling like they haven't been heard and they've been sort of fobbed off. The next one is mistakes, poor interview techniques. Classic mistake. This is where most of the problems are, right? You go into the interview unprepared, unfocused. You don't give standard instructions. You just either go in with this very passive, tell me what you want to know. You get into arguments with the person. If it's the accused person, you get into this debate rather than simply present them with the information, give them a chance to answer, and then leave. And the other one is failure to make a finding. And failure to make a finding is you get to the end of the case and you don't really make a determination about whether your policy was violated. You just kind of go, well, this person told me this, that person told me that, therefore X. And your job is really to determine whether a policy was violated, and not just to tell me what you found. Those are the classic mistakes that I see in cases.
And the one that you mentioned about treating the reporter or whistleblower, whatever we want to name them today, treating them poorly, it's something that I actually, when I'm speaking with organizations, it's something that comes up quite a bit, and expectations were not set. They don't know what's going to happen with the information. So these are all reasons that then lead people to give up and not say anything in the first place.
Exactly. And it's all our fault. I mean, these people come to us. We invite these people. These people don't just show up on our doorstep. As an organization, we go to great lengths to message this. Contact us. We care. We put up posters. We put up things, online media, right? They come to us and we completely fail, right? We don't have good intake, right? We treat it as an afterthought. And this is not the fault of the technology. This is our fault, right? We don't give thought to, well, once they call, how are we handling it? What are our protocols about information gathering? How are we managing their expectations? What do we say? What don't we say? I do trainings just on that topic. I'll actually, just as odd as life is, I have a call with a client this afternoon just on this topic, because this is key. Because the other thing, what organizations have to remember is, this is a classic touch point. When you hang up the phone with that I call it the reporter. They're making a report. When you hang up the phone with that reporter, they're going to go tell everybody about that experience. Even if you tell them not to, they're going to tell everybody about that experience. What do you want them to say? I want them to say, I just got off the phone with this Meric fellow. Funny name, nice guy. But I just got off the phone with this Meric fellow. He was actually very helpful. He wanted to know all about my concerns. He told me what they were going to do. The company has this whole approach to this stuff. Next thing you know, this person becomes an evangelist for the speak up culture. I think organizations should want to do this. And it's not that organizations don't care. I think it's an incomplete thought that they just haven't thought through the rest of the process. They're too busy congratulating themselves on how much they care, and they just haven't completed the thought. That's my opinion.
I tend to agree with you. And this is also the conversation that I have with our customers and prospects, is that the technology, whatever it is, it's just one side of the coin. You need to have the rest in order for it to be something complete for the employees.
The organization has to step up and complete the task. It's really just that simple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about fact finding, figuring out the investigation and the root cause. And you also mentioned a lot when we Google you and find you, you often say that investigations can create business value that goes beyond this of investigating, coming to a conclusion, and fact finding. Can you explain a little bit for our skeptical audience what you mean by that?
The number one job of every employee is to help their organization be successful. Now, whether you're in a sales function or you're in a staff function, like investigators, compliance, HR, or whatever, your number one job is to help the organization be successful in your role. So when you think about, well, how does the investigation process help the organization be successful? You would say, okay, well, the investigation process should help identify areas of unacceptable business risks and should help find ways for management to fix the business or improve management operations. So think about, what do managers want to see from you in that role? I would say managers want you to give them advance warning about problems. Managers want you to give them options. Managers want you to kind of see trends for them, right? Managers want you to offer them insights and value besides telling them what they already know, right? So where you're probably going wrong is when we do investigations, all we do is we point out problems. We go, hey, look what's going wrong. Look at the crummy manager you have. Look at this toxic manager. Oh, look at these people who are not supervising well, right? Look at this dysfunctional department, right? Or you make recommendations, and it turns out the recommendations are something managers can't support. Or you have ideas you have ideas that culturally or politically aren't going to work. Or this often happens. You have recommendations that step on the turf of other people, right? In other words, you come up with recommendations that are almost from an ivory tower that ignore the practical, financial, political, strategic, in terms of strategic priorities, all those realities of management, and or your guidance avoids just, well, let me walk it back. But you have all those things that you make recommendations, and they are not practical. I don't mean practical in the sense of they're easy to implement, but you just go, hi, you ought to do these things. But it doesn't consider, are they realistic? Can they really be done within the competing priorities and financial restraints that they have? The next thing is, what we often do is, are we making recommendations that truly address the core of the problem? Because when I've gone in there and I've made recommendations is, I really focus on the core of the problem. Where I've gone in, like with a toxic manager, I didn't go in and go like, hey, that's a real toxic manager. I've gone in there and said, I really think this manager is a good proficient contributor, but I don't think she has the managerial skills for her role. I think she has a fear of failure, and I think she is so concerned about failing that she's projecting that fear onto her staff. In other words, are you willing to give guidance as to the tough stuff? And finally, I think where a lot of people fail in this area is they don't forget that a lot of what compliance proposes is nice to have stuff. That's easy to forget. Rather than really, your value doesn't come from the virtue signaling stuff. Your value to them comes from telling the unpleasant truth. That's also true. If I can tell you just a quick aside, one of the best compliments I ever got as an investigator was a business executive said to me, Meric, you're like a dentist. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm glad you're there, but I know that when you call me, it's going to hurt, but you're going to fix it. Okay? But I don't want to ever call you, but I don't want to have to call you. And that's the nature of our work.
Comparing investigators to dentists, that is something that I won't forget. I think it's...
Yeah. But Daniëlla, it's true. We're in the bad news business, right? Mm-hmm. People do not call us when everything's going wonderfully. And again, it's analogy to when I was in law enforcement, is you're showing up on some of the worst days in people's lives. But we have to accept that. That's the business we've chosen.
True. And from what you just said in terms of being practical and giving more than just a diagnosis, let's say, I think it goes back to what you said earlier in terms of the values of a great investigator. Because if you have this empathy, you understand the C-suite, you understand the business priorities, and you have the critical thinking, it will be easier for you to run the investigation and its conclusion in a way that might reveal business impact aside from just punishment, let's say, for whoever did the wrongdoing.
You make a wonderful point. I never thought of it, is you need to have empathy for the managers as well as the person sitting across the table from you.
Yeah, because you need to be able to expose whatever happened to them in a way that will actually lead to changing the root cause and not just the surface level issues.
I think you're right.
And taking this part around the business and the C-level, as we have been saying, investigations will sometimes or often surface issues that leaders or the C-suite don't know about. In your experience, what are the biggest risks companies face when the executives don't have visibility into what's really happening on the ground?
Well, I think there are some risks. The most immediate one comes to mind as a lawyer is the biggest risk is that the company faces legal risks of problems in the workplace that they don't know about. So you putting aside that it's terrible and that the moral problems of it, but you have people being harmed. So imagine you have sexual harassment going on in the workplace or things like that. You have legal violations. Imagine you have people doing drugs, or you have weapons and things like that. So you have actual legal violations going on in the workplace that you don't even know about. So you have all those things. But look, let's go to the practical. Is excuse me. You have problems that continue and they spread. So you have a problem itself, but you also have then the problem continues and spread. The good people get discouraged and they think that management doesn't care at all about the good people. You have the people who are doing it and continue to do it. You have people who may be inclined to do the bad thing and now think it's okay to do it. You then have people who think that management doesn't care about the rules and management doesn't care about expectations. The culture of that particular team or that particular department or that particular group, the culture now becomes toxic, right? Because there's now a general rule of anything goes. And it's all because it could be because people weren't paying attention to the problem, or simply because you paid attention to the problem, but you treated it simply as let's get that one bad apple out of the company, treat it as a one-off issue, rather than trying to get to what was the problem that caused this issue. Mm-hmm. So that's always why if you treat it as, well, that was just Mary, and we addressed Mary without looking at, well, how did it happen, or this problem didn't occur in a vacuum. That's really how you get into that situation.
Mm-hmm. And taking what you just mentioned, that people then think that nothing is happening, that management doesn't care. This is why typically what I recommend to companies is close the loop. Tell people what is happening with these investigations. Don't disclose confidential information, but show the impact of, hey, we listened to this, and this is what we're doing about it. And being very transparent about these things can help close this loop and build this trust, and hopefully avoid what your client had when we started this conversation of a $1.5 million fraud in the business.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's actually counterintuitive, because people think when you do that you're actually going to deter bad people from doing bad things. And it actually does not deter them. But what it does is it reassures good people that the company cares that they're doing the right thing.
So and that they can speak up.
Yes. No, so it is a good thing to do it, but actually for a different reason people don't really realize.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you in that respect. Meric, you've discussed quite a bit already about what makes a great investigator, the impact that it can have on the business, and you've created the Winter Method.
Yes,
it is and congratulations, it's awesome. It seems to be a very unique approach to how to run investigations. What are its core principles?
Sure. So the Winter Method is my own methodology for conducting a workplace investigation. It's got 6 core principles. First, the reporter needs to be debriefed, so you have a full understanding of the report and all of the reporter's concerns. Second, a preliminary assessment needs to be conducted, so you understand all of the issues that are raised in the report. And you can decide which of those issues are important enough that you want to follow up on. For each of those issues that you want to follow up on, you then need to identify which, I call it a business conduct standard, but which company policy, code of conduct standard that you're going to use, and what are the elements of a violation that you would follow up on. Then you need to determine what's your resolution strategy. going to be that because not every report gets fixed with an investigation. Sometimes it can be resolved informally, right? It doesn't investigation in every case. Third, focused discovery. We're not trying to learn every issue. We're not trying to learn every answer. We just want to determine what facts are necessary to determine if that rule got violated or not. Fourth, we want to make a finding on whether the rule was broken. We want to know the contributing factors that led to the rule being broken and any specific areas that management asks us to learn about. And five, we want a proper written report to help management that gives a narrative explanation of the story, a finding as to each of the elements of the violation, and an analysis that essentially explains why we reached the correct answer, an explanation of the contributing factors, and whatever observations the investigator made. So we can basically tell people what we saw, why our conclusion was correct, and give that management guidance as to what was down. So that's in a nutshell.
And it seems very complete in the different stages that it covers.
Yeah.
How do you see in your experience that this changes the way organizations both understand and resolve misconduct?
Well, first of all, it is a lot more efficient. Too many organizations take a let's investigate the report, where they let the report kind of dictate the scope of the investigation, right? And that's a mistake, right? Because the report, they take all of this big blob of information, and instead of so they try to answer every possible issue, right? So if the report contains a big scattering of all these different things, they try to do that, and that's a mistake. Instead, it could be saying, well, the reporter in the report raises these 4 issues. I'm going to use my discretion and say, of these 4 issues, these 2 issues are the most consequential for the organization and the reporter, and I'm going to use my discretion and pick these 2. By the way, prosecutor does this all the time. And we're going to go with these 2 because this is what's appropriate under the circumstances, and we're going to investigate these 2, and then. But the investigation is only going to focus on fact-finding as to these issues. We're not going to try to answer every possible question. What that does is that means that the investigation is going to be very focused. The questions we're going to ask are going to be just focused on those 2 issues, and it's all very efficient. It works. My clients are very happy with it. The key is the investigator knows when he or she are done. This is another key thing with efficiency in casework is investigators often don't know when they're finished, right? Mm-hmm. There's a very clear finish line with the Winter method. Mm-hmm. And this is, by the way, this is all consistent with generally accepted principles. This is not radical at all. It's really just taking the best principles from around the world. I've been very lucky because in a number of companies I've worked for, I've always had a global remit. So I've been able, quite frankly, to steal the best techniques from around the world and kind of, integrate them all into the Winter method.
Mm-hmm. And it seems very systematic, which probably makes the life of the investigator also a bit easier, I would say.
Well, and there's also, it's systematic and it allows for consistency. Right, because organizations also suffer from this as well, is that too many investigators improvise on and have their own unique technique, and organizations can't have that. There's always room for individual discretion and individual styles, but each investigator can't improvise their own technique. There's got to be consistency in the organization.
Of course, and you've mentioned already that you have a lot of happy customers. Can you share with us a success story where this method has made a measurable difference?
I can remember a time where it was a success. I had a client. They asked me to do an investigation for them. They had an off-site holiday party. It was at a local bar. Managers and staff attended the party. They had drinks and food. Unfortunately, they had no restrictions in place. They had no limits on food or drink. And unfortunately, they had no responsible adults at the party. Yes, the following Monday, they received numerous hotline reports alleging sexual harassment, unwanted physical contact, you name it. They asked me to do the investigation for them, and we substantiated multiple violations of the code of conduct, as you might imagine what had happened. It turned out that what had happened was, and as you would imagine, it was all extremely well-intentioned. They wanted everybody to have a good time. They had expected everybody to use their good judgment, to use appropriate mature behavior. Right, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Instead, people all woke up on the stupid side of the bed, did binge drinking, got blackout drunk. People forgot that this was a work-related function. You can imagine, right? Besides all of the behaviors that we documented, there were also behaviors that could have been tragic. So we had, we were able to document additional behavior. So the CEO was extremely cooperative. He was like, my God, this was a tragedy in wait. So, for example, there were unaccompanied female colleagues, walking around in front of the bar at 2:00 in the morning, blackout drunk. And God knows what could have happened to them. Thank God they got home. Okay, well, things that we were just going, like my head was exploding saying this could have happened so horribly. So with the support of the executives, I focus not only on helping to hold employees accountable for their own behavior, but also pointing out the management and operational failures. My investigation report made 14 separate recommendations to help implement preventive, responsive, and detective controls to ensure a safe experience in the future. So, in other words, things as simple as drink tickets, things as simple as designated management people at the party keeping an eye out for people who had drank too much. They even had next time first aiders at the party, professional first aiders. So if somebody got too drunk, blackout drunk or something, that somebody, Ubers to make sure people got home safely, things like that, to avoid a tragedy. And also a company policy on drinking at a company party. So there could also be specific accountabilities. So that was where we used the Winter method, business focus, and it turned out to be a success story. And as far as I know, they haven't had a similar problem since then.
Well, that's good to hear. And it's also good to hear from you that the CEO was very cooperative, which I think can make a very big difference.
It makes all the difference in the world but by the way, it makes all the difference in the world when you have cooperative management. But that was no accident. That wasn't the first time I dealt with that manager, mm-hmm. Right? You also, for investigators, compliance people, those colleagues watching this webinar, you have to cultivate those relationships, mm-hmm. Right? You're to build some trust that they know you're an advisor, you're an honest broker, you're not just going to sit there at the sidelines just, going, well, you're also stupid, that you're actually, you're actually going to take a constructive approach. But yeah, mm-hmm. It was a story. I'm proud of what we did in that case.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that. And if you don't mind, I would like to change gears a little bit, because earlier we talked about closing the loop and letting the reporter know what is going to happen in the different stages. One thing that I notice a lot when I'm speaking with companies is that the fear of retaliation is still a major barrier for people to actually speak up or report on things. From your experience, what can companies realistically do to make employees feel safe to raise concerns?
Well, I think that, retaliation exists. But I also believe that much of the fear is based on the perception of retaliation.
Mhm.
But I think we can agree that perception is reality. So organizations should be focused on how you fight the perception. Because retaliation exists, but when you detect it, it's very easy to address, right? You just dismiss the person. But the perceptions are often harder to address because it's perception. So let's think about how you can do it. First of all, I don't think you can fight the perception of retaliation with smooth slogans and we care messages, right? How do you do it? First of all, you can fight the perception with a professional process that has policies and procedures for everybody to follow. And you can show people those policies and procedures. My last organization, we had an intranet site, and we posted the policies and procedures, and we welcomed people to review them. You can train your staff on intake and triage processes, right? So that when people call in, they're treated to a knowledgeable staff that's been trained. You manage your reporter and your witnesses carefully, even if you have to disappoint them. But you manage them carefully, so even if you can't tell them what they want to hear, they still feel that they've been treated fairly. You over-communicate and over-explain. Daniëlla, if you and I were working on a case together, you were one of my witnesses, you'd probably say, my God, this guy talks so much. Because I over-explain, because I assume you don't know anything about what we're working on together. But I don't want you to walk away confused or uninformed. I explain the process and what's going to happen. People need to feel that the process is fair and just, even if they don't agree with it. And that's often why people retaliate, is they retaliate because they don't believe they're going to be fairly treated, right? You also have to explain procedural fairness. You have to explain the burden of proof. You have to explain the investigator's job. You have to explain the roles, because that's why people retaliate. They don't believe they're going to be treated fairly. They don't believe the process is going to be fair. So you have to explain these things. And that's why people retaliate, because they don't believe they have an alternative but to retaliate. These are what the organization has to think about, is why do people retaliate? And then if the reasons why people retaliate, then they can start addressing them. That's my opinion.
So it's really looking at it, let's almost say holistically, and over-explaining everything so that there is transparency, that there is clarity.
Yeah, exactly. And ask yourself, yes, we don't want people to retaliate, but take a step back, look at it analytically. What leads people to retaliate? And then you can start to address why people do it and think, well, what can we do to fight that mindset that would lead people to retaliate?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Still in this subject, but people need to be able to report somehow. There are hotlines, there are different ways to do it. In your opinion, what role does anonymous reporting tools have in helping organizations detect issues early and uncover also employee insights?
Oh, I think they're very important. Absolutely important. Look, from an investigator's perspective, nothing is better than an in-person discussion with a reporter who identifies themselves and tells you everything they know, and they have personal knowledge of all the facts. Nothing is better than that. But remember, if something wrong is going on in the company, management needs to know about it so we can get fixed, right? And a lot of people don't want to speak up, quite honestly, simply because they don't want to get involved. Yes, you have people who fear retaliation, but my belief is that more often people just don't want to get involved. So I think from an organization's perspective, if the choice is either I'll know it anonymously, I'll know it from an anonymous person, or I won't know it at all, I'd much rather know it from an anonymous person. And if an anonymous person feels less inhibited to tell me everything than if they were identified, fine. So tell me anonymously. Here's the thing. From an investigator's perspective, your identity is not as important as what you know, telling me what you know, and telling me how you know what you know. Those are the two things for an investigator, right? So that's what's critical. So but here's the thing I would challenge organizations on. When you have anonymous reporting tools, you have to remember that there's a very good chance that that is the only chance that I, as an investigator, will have to get that information, right? Many anonymous reporters are like one-time only reporters, right? And we may try to get them to follow up with a report. We all do our best with that. But we all know that the odds are that they're never going to come back. So we have to put in the best tools possible with that report to find out the who, what, where, when, and why, as much specificity as possible in that initial contact. That we have to do more than just simply say, tell me what hurts, and have them go on their way. That would be, because my motives are selfish, right? I have to investigate that report. So if it's just this summary, here's my grievance, or here's who hurt my feelings, or here's who took stole my lunch out of the canteen, I'm glad to know. But if you want me to follow up, and if I can just add one more thought, a lot of people make those anonymous reports, put in insufficient facts. We can't follow up on them because they're threadbare with facts. And guess what happens? Then they walk away feeling, I made a report, management didn't do anything, they're unhappy, they feel we fobbed them off, and it was all because they gave us insufficient facts. See how it's a vicious circle? And that's why we have to do a better job as organizations in what we put in those landing pages or in our technology that says we know in our hearts we're only going to find out once, and we have to get that information from them, as information as possible with that one-time only chance.
And make the ask specific to get the information. Mm-hmm.
We're only going to get one opportunity, so we got to do it.
Mm-hmm. Going back a little bit to what we discussed earlier, your family experience in law enforcement, you even mentioned studying to be a lawyer, prosecution. When people hear about investigations, there's typically this reaction of thinking of them as either reactive or punitive. How can, in your opinion, organizations make this shift to make people think of them more as a driver of positive change and improvements?
Well, a few things. First, they have to have a willingness to focus on improving the business rather than just look at an investigation result as a fix it and drive on attitude. The second thing is they have to look at investigations in general as that the purpose of the investigation process is not just to catch bad guys and fire them, but that the purpose of the investigation process, the primary purpose of the process, is to identify areas of unacceptable business risk. And third, they've got to be willing to invest in the staff who conduct investigations, so that these people can deliver good results, that these people have the proper skills and experience. I was just talking to a prospective client week before last, and they're and they sound like lovely people, and they parachuted somebody in who used to be in audit, parachuted somebody in who used to be in HR, and now they're doing compliance investigations. Well, how are you going to sell management on the value of investigations when you don't have really good, properly trained investigators? So again, if you're going to focus on long-term improvements, these are the things I think you have to focus on. But you've got to change that manager mindset that it's not fix it and drive on, and it's not catch the bad guys and get rid of them. That the whole purpose of the investigation process is fix the business.
Mm-hmm. I think that is really good advice, and we hope we have some executives listening to this as well. Okay. Meric, we're entering the last part of our conversation. Let's say the advice and vision chapter of our conversation.
Okay.
There are a lot of young compliance and HR professionals that are just starting out in investigations? As you just mentioned, these people that had been parachuted into the role. What advice would you give these young professionals?
Well, let's see. As I think back on 25 years, I'll give them a few pieces of advice. First of all, self-care. Remember, self-care when you do investigations. If you do this job well, you leave a little piece of yourself with every case. If you do your job right, you're going to change people's careers. You may even change their lives and realize that. Next thing I'd say is never say always and never say never. There are a lot of exceptions you will make, and this is not a job with a lot of absolutes. And also be comfortable with discomfort. We're in the bad news business, and you are going to be telling people a lot of what they don't want to hear. And you're going to be wishing you could say a lot of things and reassure people. Like if somebody says, like, am I going to get fired? And you'd like to say something comforting to people, and you know they're going to get fired, and you'd like to say something reassuring, and you have to say, I really can't say, but you really know they are. And you're going to feel terrible about it, but you're going to have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's some of the advice I give.
Mm-hmm. It's a hard career, that's for sure.
It's not for everyone, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And from what you've mentioned so far in your experiences, it really sounds to me that investigators are often caught between the employees and the leadership of the organization. How do you see the role of the investigator evolving as a bridge between these two sides?
Well, I think I thought about that question. I think it could serve a valuable role. First of all, I think of the investigator as being impartial, meaning that when employees and leadership kind of go at each other, each of them has an agenda. The investigator really doesn't care. I remember in those conversations, I've sort of said, I don't care. I get paid either way. You're an objective fact finder, so I thought when I've given readouts after an investigation to both leadership and employees, I've been sort of like, look, I just call the facts as I see it. I don't really I sort of give the answer without fear or favor. I can be focused on contributing factors and root causes. And when I've, given those readouts, I've been able to be fair and said, you were right when you said this, or you were right when you said that. And the answer is, I'm not really smarter than anybody, but, I am trained in investigating. I am trained in analysis. I have experience in I guess I have a high EQ and emotional quotient, so I do have, a powers, I do have, good experience in analytics. I think that's where, you can become that bridge. And bottom line is you just don't have a stake in it. So you can become, I guess, to sort of bottom line, you become like an honest broker.
Becoming neutral like Switzerland.
Yeah, you're just neutral. And, what I was like, I'm like, I don't care. I can kind of call it the way I see it. Mm-hmm. But it's not just that I'm neutral. I'm also a trained observer. So, I also know what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. It's also, you're one part psychologist also. Mm-hmm. And that can be fun too, because you can also be a bit of a peacemaker, and that can be nice too.
It also sounds to me that, like in every career, lifelong learning is important, to always try to improve yourself and see how you can do better.
I'd like to make a point on that. One of the things I say to people is, you have to be a lifelong learner in this business. And you ask yourself, do you have 10 years of experience in investigating, or do you have a year of experience 10 times? Because you meet a lot of people in investigations, and you say to them, how long have you been doing investigations? Oh, I've been doing investigations for 10 years, and they have minimal skills. And it's just 10 years of, no, serious. It's 10 years of accumulated bad habits.
Mhm.
and nothing else.
That is very sad. And speaking of 10 years, where do you see the field of investigations in the workplace heading in the next decade?
Well, I think it's really up to the people who are watching us. It's always going to be here in some form. You're always going to need investigations. But where it fits in your organization is kind of, up to the people in your organization. So you really need to decide and plan. I've always tried to approach it in an entrepreneurial sense. I never really sort of sat back, with this belief in unconditional love. I always thought that was just too dangerous. Maybe it was just my career trajectory, getting back to my curious LinkedIn profile, which would explain it. I had a really good boss back at AT&T, and he taught me early on and said, you have to give your boss a good reason every day for having hired you. So, you have to showcase your value. So I think you combine that with always taking an entrepreneurial approach to your job. So I think you have to be looking for a way to make yourself relevant in the organization. And that was where I came up with the idea of making it business focused. Is if you can make yourself business focused, then you're going to be demonstrating your value, and then you're going to have relevance. And relevance is critical. Now, where I think we make ourselves vulnerable, especially, say, in compliance investigations, is, we develop a bubble think. In other words, we become enamored with our own utility by talking to ourselves, right? We don't engage with management. We don't engage with the people who approve our budgets. And then we go to conferences and we talk to other compliance people. You can see this on LinkedIn, or you can see this on the emails we get from organizations, and we become, enamored with our own shadows. And in other words, I think what it is we become intellectually lazy. And, we believe our own messages, and instead of saying, where are we going next? So I would encourage us to think about that. Or we let regulation decide. The EU or someone else, with the Department of Justice here in the U.S., comes out with a regulation, and we say to our companies, we have to do this. And they say, like we do here in the United States, we're like, well, when was the last time we were prosecuted by the DOJ? And we're like, never. And they said, good, come back when we are, right? It's not a good selling point. I'm sure it's the same way in Europe as well. So again, I would say, where are we? We're heading in the next decade. It said it's up to us to decide, and we should decide, just even for our own self-interest, which is always the most important interest, in my opinion.
That was very insightful, and I agree that it's also about people taking into their own hands where things will go a little bit. So I do agree with that. Our final question of the day, Meric, and thank you so much for your patience so far. If you had to summarize your philosophy around investigations in one sentence, what would you say?
Use both your heart and your head, because a good investigator needs both their heart and their brain.
Thank you, Meric, so much for joining us today and for the insights that you've shared. Your experience and perspective are really valuable for anyone who is listening. I think it reminded us that investigations aren't only about fixing problems, they're also about learning from them and making organizations stronger. For those listening, one takeaway I think is pretty clear. When people feel safe speaking up, issues get caught earlier, risks are reduced, and leaders can make better decisions. And that's also what we focus on at FaceUp, giving employees a safe way to raise concerns so that companies can act before small problems turn into big ones. If today's discussion got you thinking about how to encourage employees to speak up, we'd love to continue the conversation. And you can explore FaceUp with a free trial or a quick demo at your convenience. Meric, thank you again so much for joining us, and to everyone who joined the webinar today. If you have any questions, feel free to send them our way, and we will get back to you.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed my time.